Hello, 2BC. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're continuing our study of Mark's Gospel, and we'll be in Mark 9 today. Will you pray with me as we get started? God, I thank you so much for today. I thank you for your word, and I thank you for when we read your word, you form us and you transform us, God. I pray that you will do just that as we open your word together today, God. We love you and pray all of this in Jesus' holy and precious name. Amen. So we are in Mark 9 today. Last week, we left Jesus and his disciples on the way. They were walking along and Jesus was teaching them. Remember, we had Peter's declaration that Jesus is the Messiah. And chapter 9, starting in verse 2, is where we're going to pick up the story. And this starts 6 days later. And so we're going to cover the whole chapter today. So we're going to start here in verse 2, and we have a little bit of an unusual chronological marker here. Mark has been just telling us thing after thing after thing is happening, but without a whole lot of sense of the passage of time. So if we look here, we have 6 days later. So 6 days after what has come before. And so after this declaration that Peter has made, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John with him, and they led them up to a high mountain where they could be all alone. And so they were not told exactly where this mountain is, but they go up this mountain. And when we hear about mountain experiences in Scripture, we should automatically think there is something significant that is going to happen, some sort of revelation from God. People in Scripture go up the mountain to meet with God. We've seen Moses do that. We've seen Elijah do that. And just encourage you to spend some time thinking about and maybe even looking back in the Old Testament and seeing the times that people went up a mountain to meet with God and what happened there. Usually it's something significant. And Jesus takes just the 3 disciples up the mountain with him. These are the first 3 that Jesus calls in Mark's Gospel. And they were also the same 3 that were chosen to come and witness Jesus raising Jairus' daughter back to life. And so they are his inner circle in many ways. And so he takes them up this mountain, and then he is transfigured before them. And his clothes became dazzling white and whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And so there's this crazy experience that they have. And before we read too much more into it, I want to point your attention to Exodus, to Moses' time on the mountain with God. I want to encourage you to go back and read Exodus 24 and then read Exodus 34, 29 through 35. Read those passages, look through them, and see what similarities you notice between Moses' time on the mountain with God on Mount Sinai and Jesus' transfiguration. It's very fascinating to look at some of those similarities, from the fact that there was a specific number of people and the shininess, the dazzling, radiant white of Jesus's clothes versus Moses and how his skin became radiant after he had spent time up on the mountain with God. We have God speaking out of a cloud and just a voice from within this cloud. So God's presence often is seen as this cloud that descends, like if you remember back in Exodus, the cloud that would descend on the mountain or it would descend on the tent of meeting. So God speaking from within this cloud is something we see throughout Scripture, and people being astonished. So there's some many similarities. So please take the time to go and read that, because when we have some of these Old Testament experiences like Moses and his experience, we are meant to hear echoes of that here in Mark 9. And what happened with Moses up on the mountain can help shed some light on what happens with Jesus here up on the Mount of Transfiguration. And so with Moses up on the mountain in Exodus, we see God giving the people the law and making a covenant with them. And in many ways, it was that redemptive act, right? He's choosing those people and making a covenant with them. You are going to be my people. And here are the terms of that covenant. And now here in Mark 9, we have Jesus up on the mountain, and God is going to complete his redemptive work through Jesus, death, life, death, and resurrection. And so we're going to see that here. And I think that imagery and how there's these ties together is just so fascinating. And I love it. I love to look backwards and see. So let's see what exactly did happen up on this mountain. I already mentioned the dazzling white clothing, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And then Elijah and Moses appear, and they're talking with Jesus. And we're not told what they're saying, and we're not told why they're there. So scholars have posited many different theories for why Elijah and Moses specifically are mentioned. One possible theory is that Moses represents the law because he was the one who was given the law, and Elijah is representative of the prophets. And when you read through the law and the prophets, you definitely hear about Jesus, right? And the prophecies about Jesus and just the promise of Jesus. We get that as we read the Old Testament. And so in some ways, Moses and Elijah could represent that entirety of the law, and the prophets are speaking to Jesus and who he is. But also, I was reading this week, and Dr. Garland, in his commentary on Mark, was talking about how the conversation when the disciples and Jesus are coming back down off the mountain is quite significant as we try to interpret why were Moses and Elijah mentioned. So if we look at their conversation, so we're going to jump ahead a little bit, but don't worry, we're going to talk about this whole section. So as they're coming down off the mountain, they ask Jesus, why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? And so, and then he says, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wish, just as it is written about him. So the disciples are very much asking about the end of time kind of things, like when the Son of Man comes to restore all things, like when they're asking about questions of the end. And in many ways, Moses was, and Elijah both were eschatological figures, meaning, eschatological meaning of the end, things pertaining to the end of time. And so Moses was the first deliverer, right? He brought the people out of Egypt. And people were expecting another prophet like Moses. There's a prophecy or a promise in Deuteronomy 18:15 that speaks to that. And they were wanting someone to appear to liberate them and to bring them out of their current situation, right? Then we have Elijah, and he was to appear at the dawn of the end of time. So the beginning of the end. And this will also be at the beginning of the ultimate redemption of Israel. And we see that promise in Malachi. If you want to flip with me to Malachi, let's look at Malachi 4, verses 4 through 6. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws I gave him at Horeb for all Israel. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. And so we see Elijah promised. We also see Moses mentioned. And so in these two, we see the hope of this final redemption of Israel that the people had been waiting for centuries. But let's back up just a little bit and look a little bit more about what happened. So Moses and Elijah appear, and Peter and James and John are present, and Peter, being the talkative one, sometimes I think he's just the group spokesman, or maybe he just has lots to say. But he says, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And it says he did not know what to say. They were so frightened. So once again, we see the disciples frightened by what is happening before them. We saw them frightened whenever Jesus was walking towards them on the water. And really, Peter doesn't understand what's going on. So he just says something that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And we're even told in the aside that he just didn't understand still. And then we have the cloud appearing and covering them. So across the mountain, the top of this mountain, and a voice coming from the cloud. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. And so God speaks very plainly. Jesus is God's son, and they are to listen to him. And then all of a sudden, just as quickly as I'm sure it happened, they look around and no one is there except for Jesus. How would you feel if you were Peter, James, or John and you were standing there on that mountain and witnessed all of this? What would be your first thought? How would you feel hearing this voice coming out of the cloud, talking to you, and you can understand, talking about this rabbi you've been following around? What would you think? How would you respond? So as they're coming down the mountain, Jesus gives the command that we've come to expect as we've read through Mark's gospel to say, hey, don't tell anybody. And these three disciples, unlike some of the people we've read previously who go and tell anyways, these three disciples were told, don't tell anybody. Because Jesus says, don't tell anyone what they've seen until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. And they kept the matter to themselves. It says they discussed it with each other. I wanted to know what rising from the dead meant, but they did not share it. They didn't go out and blare it on the mountaintops, right? And so we see Jesus as they are coming down the mountain, telling them not to say until he has risen from the dead, but also, as we just read a few minutes ago, that he will be rejected and suffer. And what has happened to Elijah, meaning John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist is the Elijah who comes first, is going to happen to him. So we have the transfiguration, and right before the transfiguration, Jesus has talked about what's going to happen to him and how he's going to suffer. And right after it, he's talking about how he's going to suffer. One of the things that Dr. Garland pointed out about how this is arranged here in Mark's gospel is that it is highlighting the fact that God's kingdom is coming, and it's here and it's happening, but it's going to advance. God's reign is going to advance through the death of the Messiah. Suffering is going to happen. Even though they've seen Jesus in all of his glory shining on top of this mountain and heard God say who he is, suffering is the path forward. And so that when they do get to the end and they're watching all of this happen before their eyes, they should be able to recall this and say, oh, this is what he was talking about. Okay. But we know the disciples are just really slow to completely understand, as I think all of us would have been if we were in the same place. So they come down off of this mountain and they come back down to where the people are, where the other disciples are, and they are met with quite the scene, right? We have the disciples and there is a large crowd around them, and there's also some teachers of the law there. And they're arguing with the disciples. And we're not really told why they're arguing with the disciples, but we are told in verse 15. I think this is so interesting. This is something that stood out to me this week as I was reading. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. Why were they overwhelmed with wonder? And I think it was interesting as I was reading and studying this week, because it makes you wonder, was there some residual shininess? I mean, Moses had the residual shininess. That's why he had to wear a veil. That's in Exodus 34, if you want to read about that. But here's Jesus. He's coming back down off of this mountain, and all of the people are just overwhelmed with wonder. There's this argument going on, and they're overwhelmed with wonder, and they run over to greet Jesus. So Jesus goes and asks, what are you arguing about? And they're told that the disciples were unable to cast out a demon from this boy. It was a terrible situation for this boy and his father. It says when it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashing his teeth, and becomes rigid. And it says, I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. So the disciples have failed. Now we know Jesus has given them the authority over these evil spirits, right? And they have the authority to go out and cast out demons and to preach and all of the things that we talked about a couple weeks ago. But here we see them not able to carry that out. And there's a crowd, and it's all on display for this crowd and the religious leaders. So I'm sure the argument has something to do with some of that. And Jesus responds to this situation. And it sounds maybe a little harsh to our ears. I don't know if it sounds harsh to yours, but it says, you unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. And when we hear this, how long, we should be thinking more along the lines of, I don't have much longer. So the time is short, right? Jesus is headed towards death. We know that's coming. I mean, Mark's only 16 chapters anyways, and we're in chapter 9 today. So we are headed towards Jerusalem. That is where the story is going. So they bring the boy to Jesus, and immediately the Spirit throws him to the ground in a convulsion, and he falls to the ground and he rolls around. He's foaming at the mouth. So it's putting on quite the show. And so Jesus has this conversation with the father, and he asks him, how long has he been like this? And this father says, from childhood. It'll often throw him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. And so Jesus takes a point on this. Like, if you can, everything is possible for one who believes. I think that this father is so relatable because his response is, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. He wants to believe, right? He wants to believe that Jesus can do something, but almost it's been too hard. The situation has just gone on for so long. Almost, I'm sure other people have tried. I mean, the disciples had tried. I'm sure they're not the first ones to try to do something about it. And I can just imagine the despair and the hopelessness of this situation. And he wants to hope that Jesus could do something, but he's cautious and he doesn't know for sure. So he responds so honestly, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. I want us to dwell on this for a minute because I think this highlights the importance of having faith in the midst of times of doubt. This father wants to believe, but he needs Jesus' help to help him believe. And I think that sometimes it can be really easy to think of God can heal people, right? He can cast out demons, but we also need his help sometimes to have the faith that we need. So this is such an honest prayer. And I think that if we were all truly honest, many of us have been in this kind of a place where we want so desperately to believe that God can do something or believe something about God, but we just don't have enough faith. Well, we can talk to God about that and we can ask him to help us have the faith, right? He can provide that faith. He can help us with that. He can heal us in that way. And, Jesus is saying everything is possible for one who believes. And this is not if you believe hard enough, then something's going to happen. This is more of the idea that that you shouldn't put limits on God's power, right? Your faith should be open that God can do anything because God is limitless. So we shouldn't try to hem God in or try to put boundaries because true faith does not set limits on God's power. And so this father prays this prayer, and Jesus then rebukes the spirit and he commands him to come out of the boy and never enter him again. And the spirit shrieks and convulses the boy again. And then the boy looks like he's dead, but then Jesus takes him by the hand and raises him up. And we should hear some sort of resurrection imagery here of raising him up, lifting him to his feet. He's coming out of this darkness that I'm sure that he has been trapped in. We were told by the father since childhood. So then Jesus and his disciples continue on and they go inside, and his disciples want to know, why couldn't we cast out this demon? Why couldn't we do it? And Jesus replies, this kind can come out only by prayer. And so then we have this combination of faith and prayer here that Jesus is pointing out. So we had to focus more on faith with the Father, but now we have a focus on prayer with the disciples. And so it's not, I prayed about it, so it's going to happen. No, name it, claim it, anything like that. But it's this prayer of this close, enduring relationship with God. That's how Dr. Garland phrased it. It's not some sort of magical formula or some sort of special technique, because exorcism in the ancient world was expected that you could learn a technique or perform a series of actions or do something just the right way, say something just the right way. There was this technique side of things. So it was more of a matter of technique and not a matter of faith and prayer. But Jesus is saying that, no, this is about faith and this is about prayer. And this is about a connection with God, because it's not that that you're doing it, that God has trained you and now you have this technique to cast out demons. It's that God's power is at work through you. Because casting out demons is always God's business. It's the power that belongs to God. So the reason the disciples could do it was because of God's power at work in them and through them. And you receive that power through this prayer life and this ongoing life of prayer. So it's this ongoing connection with God. And so then at this point, we see Jesus take a decided tack to want to teach his disciples. We said last week he was making more intentional time to talk to his disciples, but we're told that explicitly here in verse 30. They left that place and passed through Galilee, but Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. So he wanted to remain more incognito and not have throngs of people following him about, because he had things he wanted to teach his disciples. And there's several teaching sections here as they're continuing on the way. So this way they're passing through Galilee, and he teaches them again about the fact that he is going to have to suffer. So we have another prediction of that. He's going to be delivered into the hands of men and they're going to kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise. So he's continuing to teach them this. But this time, the disciples still don't understand, but they don't say anything. Instead, while they're on the way to Capernaum, they were arguing about who was the greatest. That's the next thing that happens. So then Jesus teaches them about that. And what is it going to be like in his kingdom? Well, anyone who wants to be first must be last, right? And this is whenever he brings a child and sets the child in front of them. And it says, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. So he's reminding them that it's not about power. It's not about notoriety or being well known or being the greatest. It's about being the servant. It's about being the least. And it's about welcoming those who are considered the least in society. And children were not thought of in the same way we think of children today. They were thought more, they were the lowest in society, or almost all the way. They were insignificant. They were largely invisible. Because they were dependent on people for everything they needed. And so children were not thought of as very highly. And so Jesus is telling the disciples, hey, you need to welcome one of these little children in my name. Welcome me. It's the same as welcoming me. Ministering to those who are the poor or the oppressed or the forgotten or the invisible. Notice those people. It's not about noticing the great people or being great yourself. It's only whenever you are last will you be first. And then right on the heels of that conversation, we have John telling Jesus, hey, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, but we told him not to do it because he was not one of us. And then Jesus saying, don't stop him. And then Jesus says, because whoever is not against us is for us. So it's continuing to redefine what their understanding of what Jesus is doing and what he's calling them to do, right? He's not calling them to be great. He's not calling them to be some exclusive club. He is calling them to pattern their lives after him, to pick up their cross daily and follow him. Starting in verse 42, we have this last section where Jesus says, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for them if a large millstone were hung around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. And then he goes on and uses other very vivid language about if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better for you to be crippled than to be thrown into hell, or better for you to have only one hand than to be thrown into hell. And if your eye is causing the same thing, gouge it out. Now, is he saying to mutilate yourself? No, that wasn't part of Jewish theology either. But he is saying take drastic action. If there's something in your life that is causing or leading you to sin, take drastic action and cut it out. Like, get rid of it. Completely separate yourself from it. And sometimes sin does require, to escape sin and to stop doing something like that, does require us to take drastic action. Now, we shouldn't be harming ourselves in any way, and that's not what Jesus is meaning. But it may mean that, okay, I need to not have my cell phone for a while if it's causing something to happen, or whatever it is. And just have to take those drastic actions. Sometimes we have to take those drastic actions in order to flee from sin, right? We see that is another way we can think of it, is we want to flee. So go in the complete opposite direction whenever we are trying to avoid that. Then we have this whole conversation about saltiness. And Jesus talking about how salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt among yourselves and be at peace with each other. Essentially, Jesus is saying salt isn't useful if it doesn't taste like salt anymore. So a disciple is not useful if he or she is not doing what Jesus is showing them and guiding them to do. Then you're not being useful either, right? We aren't being useful if we're not doing what Jesus is guiding us to do. And then he ends with this note of having salt among yourselves and being at peace with each other. So we see in this section of Mark, we've seen a lot of arguments going on with the disciples, arguing with the religious leaders, arguing amongst themselves, trying to say who's allowed to cast out demons and who's not. And Jesus saying, have salt among yourselves and be at peace with each other. You think about sharing a meal with someone, having salt among yourselves, like sharing a meal with someone. That's like a peaceful fellowship thing usually, right? I don't really want to go to a contentious dinner, but think about sharing meals with friends or family and be able to sit and be at peace with one another in peaceful fellowship, and how that what that feels like. So Jesus is reminding them of who they're supposed to be and how they're supposed to interact with one another and others in general. So we have this teaching section where Jesus really is kind of driving at some of those things that the disciples still aren't understanding. His death, his resurrection, and what their role is supposed to be and not be, and how they're supposed to carry it out. He's continuing to teach them. He's continuing to prepare them for what is going to happen in a very short amount of time, and then what's going to happen after he is resurrected and goes up to heaven, right? He is preparing them, even though they are still not getting it. But I relate so much to the disciples, and just they're not quite getting it all the way. I appreciate that, because sometimes I feel like it can be really easy to think, oh, well, I should always understand everything and I should be able to be perfect. But the disciples weren't perfect. They missed a lot, and they had Jesus right there with them. So I think that we can all give ourselves a little grace whenever we are pursuing Jesus, or we don't understand something, or we didn't understand that what Jesus was calling us to do or telling us to do in a certain situation, and we missed it or something. But that's when we give ourselves some grace, and we keep putting one foot in front of the other, and we ask God for help, and we ask him to help us to have the faith to keep moving forward. So we're going to be continuing our study of Mark next week, and Pastor Dana is actually going to be doing the video. So I hope you will enjoy that, and I'll be back in 2 weeks. See you then. Bye.